All right, let's start an argument. What was the first real muscle car to come out of Detroit? And I'll throw the first punch, because if you said anything other than GTO, I think you're wrong. Hi there, Rick Jabrul with another chapter in the automotive evolution. Once again, I'm here at the Martin Auto Museum, and as you probably know by now, I've told you it's a great collection with more than 170 cars, and they're all important parts of the automotive journey. And this GTO right here, well, this holds a very special place in the hearts of many car enthusiasts everywhere. In fact, many people believe that it was the GTO that was the start of the muscle car era, and I'm one of those people. But before we talk about this car in particular, this 1966 model, make sure you like and subscribe. And in the comments below, let me know what I got right and what I got wrong. There's always something I got wrong. And tell me your GTO stories, because I know you've got them. All right, let's talk GTO. Because as I mentioned, the car we have right here in the museum is a 1966 model. But you know, we really have to go back to the beginning to tell the full GTO story. It goes back to the early 1960s. Now, officially, Pontiac wasn't even supposed to be building this car. In fact, in 1963, GM banned its division from racing. Performance was a bad word. But behind closed doors, Pontiac's performance masterminds, guys like John DeLorean, and his whole team quietly slipped the GTO into production. Initially, it was an option package for the Tempest. But once it started to sell, well, the suits up above decided that while they may not like racing, that didn't mean they couldn't sell performance and make a little money at the same time. And by 1966, the GTO had become so wildly popular that Pontiac could no longer keep it a secret. The GTO became its own model, front and center, in the spotlight. And while a lot of car makers had performance options, Pontiac gave the GTO its own stage. If you bought a GTO, everybody knew exactly what you had. All right. They might not know exactly how many horsepower was under that hood, but they knew it was a lot, and they knew you had paid extra for performance. Now, the other car companies pretty soon followed suit. Before the GTO, performance in something that wasn't a true sports car was really just an extra. After the GTO, performance became its own end, the final goal. And this 1966 GTO, that's a very important step along that path. Let's walk around and take a look at the styling on our 1966 Pontiac GTO, because there was a pretty significant change from 1965 to 1966. It started up front. In fact, it has a much more prominent, we'll call it the beak, the Pontiac beak that you can see right here. The Pontiac emblem that was down below got moved up above. Still had the same stacked headlights, but the styling was different. Still has the same hood scoop that isn't functional. It's just for looks right there. But when you go down the side of the car, that's where things really begin to significantly change. General Motors went to a new styling within their world, and this is what they call the Coke bottle styling. Notice, to start with, how it's more rounded on the side, and then go back to these, the area just above the fenders, the styling right here. Notice this line and how it kind of slides up and goes back down. It's really a much more prominent look, really a beautiful look, I think. And you'll see it in a lot of the GM products from 1965 with the big Chevys through the A-body cars. And this is an A-body car. That wheelbase, by the way, 115 inches, the same thing as a Chevelle or a Cutlass, the other cars that were on the A-body. Now, not only did you get the great badging, but there were also some other subtle differences, like that hood scope, and then these tail lights. If you look at a Le Mans, it has the same bright work, the same look right here, but these louvered tail lights are only for the GTO. By the way, the 1965 car had tail lights that wrapped around, and they're flatter through this section, so there's a pretty significant difference as you look along. Once again, we'll take a look all the way up. This, of course, is a resto mod. I love these Krager SS wheels, which were very popular in their time, still look great today. This is also what we call a hardtop. Now, they actually had three different cars that you could get in GTOs back in those days. You could get a convertible, and they sold about 13,000 convertibles, but this was the most popular. It was called a hardtop, and they sold 74,000 of those. There was also a coupe, which the coupe had what we call a B-pillar right here. It was a more prominent look. It was a little bit stronger, but you know, this is a much nicer look in terms of being cleaner, but it didn't have as much strength in a rollover. So eventually, the concept of the hardtop car without a B-pillar right here would go away. But it is a cleaner look. By the way, one other advantage in 1966 that came along is that the GTO, as I mentioned, became its own model. That meant that if you were buying a GTO, you could look at the VIN number and you knew it was the real deal. You knew it wasn't just a Le Mans or a Tempest that was being upgraded. The VIN number alone would tell you you had the real thing. I can show you what the hardtop concept looks like without the B-pillar. All you did was you simply lowered the rear window, you reached up, you lowered the front window. And remember, this was the most popular body style that was sold for GTO that year. And you can see why. Without that obnoxious looking B-pillar, it's a beautiful open space. Very popular for that year. Now, as I mentioned, the GTO we have here at the museum is a resto mod. One look under the hood and you know that's a long way from stock. In fact, this has a 400 cubic inch Pontiac engine. That engine did not really come along until 1967. What should have been here was a 389. And that 389, well, you had several options when it came to horsepower. The base version of the 389 came with a single 4-barrel carburetor that made 335 horsepower, already more than enough to put the GTO ahead of some of its competition. But the engine that made this GTO a legend was what we call the tri-power setup. This option used 3 2-barrel Rochester carburetors, and when all three opened up under full throttle, the 389 roared to life with 360 horsepower and pretty instant throttle response. Now, it turns out there was a third engine available, but it's super rare. Only about 190 Ram Air 389s were built. Same 360 horses, but had a hotter cam, stronger springs, different gears, and the scoop was actually punched out, had to be done at the dealer. Pontiac's V8 had been around since 1955, starting as a small 287 cubic inch motor. By the late 50s, Pontiac engineers had expanded it into larger displacements. By 1959, the 389, well, that was born. This engine became the foundation for Pontiac's performance reputation, powering everything from the full-size sedans to NASCAR stock car racers. And to manage that power, you could either get a standard 3-speed manual, step up to a close ratio 4-speed, or even get a heavy-duty automatic. Now, if you combine the optional limited slip rear axles and different gear ratios, the GTO could be tuned for anything from stoplight drag races to highway cruising. All right, let's step inside our 1966 Pontiac GTO. And Pontiac definitely wanted you to have a different experience in this car than you were having if you bought a Tempest or a Le Mans. It was a little more upscale. For example, most of the Tempest or Le Mans were likely to come with a bench seat. You could get a bench seat in the GTO, but most people would get the Strato bucket, these cool kind of sculpted seats. You had better vinyl patterns for it. So it was just a different experience than what you were going to get. On the dash as well, you got the rally gauges, you got wood trim behind it. Not likely to see that in the Le Mans or the Tempest. You could get a tachometer, although this one is an aftermarket. As I mentioned, this is a resto mod. That's a little more prominent. Those extra gauges down below. The back seat has a surprisingly large amount of room. Now remember, this was an A-body car for General Motors. This was designed to be a mid-sized family car, and the family could absolutely fit back there. That was the beauty of this car in this range. In this car, we've got the automatic, so it's cool, but you got the console, which was really a nice touch. Together with these Strato buckets, this console really made the car feel sportier, more of a cockpit feel. And of course, over there in front of the passenger was a nice GTO badge with a little grab bar, so they knew exactly what kind of cool car they were riding in. And I should point out, 1966 was the high water mark for the GTO. They sold 96,000 of the model that year. That is the most GTOs that were ever sold in a single year. So did Pontiac create the perfect muscle car? Well, there's an awful lot of people that would argue absolutely. The 66 GTO hit the sweet spot. It was powerful, stylish, affordable, and it was perfectly timed. It was balanced enough to drive daily, yet wild enough to rule out on the drag strip. Few cars since then have really made that blend so completely and so smoothly. This body style would stick around for another year. In 1968, things would change in a big way with a prominent beak and that Endura bumper. The Judge arrived in 1969, adding some fun graphics, bold colors, and the Ram Air engines that cemented the GTO street reputation. But by the early 1970s, rising insurance rates, stricter emission rules, and the fuel crisis began to slow down the muscle car market. The GTO soldiered on through the early 70s before being downsized and eventually fading out by 1974. Pontiac did revive the GTO in 2004 using an Australian-built Holden as its foundation. That brought back rear-wheel drive V8 performance to the lineup. And while it had some good performance and good power and modern handling, its understated styling had some enthusiasts wishing for more of a bolder reinterpretation of that original car. So let's go back to our original question. Was the Pontiac GTO the original muscle car? I mean, there's plenty of cars that can say they had performance. The 300 series from Chrysler, great engine. But really, they were not selling performance as the end destination. When the GTO came along, that's what this car was all about. This car was simply about taking a family car and turning it into a muscle car, a performance car. And I would argue that the GTO delivered on every level and delivered before a lot of its competitors were doing exactly the same thing.